This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. Well, I'm really getting into the show in my articles now that S4 is over. I've got quite a great list of guests and topics that I'm going to be analyzing and talking about. And one of them that I really wanted to hit on after this year's S4 was SBOMs. Since we had the SBOM Pavilion and the SBOM Challenge, I actually talked to Matt about doing this before S4, and we said, no, it's too busy. Let's hold off till afterwards. But so my guest on this episode is Matt Wyckhouse of Finite State. Liz, can you bring Matt up? And Matt, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't even look for your official title before we did this. You're CEO, right?
Right. Yep. I'm founder and CEO at Finite State.
And how long have you been with the company?
So 5.5 years now, which is getting hard to believe.
Yeah. Here we think it's the early days and you've been at it for 5.5 years. It's really something.
It feels like yesterday and 20 years ago simultaneously.
And when did you really start? A lot of times in startups, there's a couple people early on putting together plans, raising some seed money. When did you start to get to like employee number 10 and really start to move the company?
So we officially started the company 5.5 years ago, and that was coincident with our seed round, which was a pretty big one. It was a $7 million round. So we kind of shot out of the gates, maybe a little too fast in hindsight, but that's always the fun trade-off with startups. So we were at employee 10, I think within the first year of the company. So yeah, certainly within the first year.
I was listening to a podcast where the founders from Instagram were on, and they're now starting Architect, which I think is their second firm. And they said there's a lot of books on what to do for first-time entrepreneurs. But he's like, you learn all these things. There's no books on what to do on second-time entrepreneurs. And he said, you end up just making a whole new set of mistakes, and you have a whole new set of quandaries. I think it's impossible to do it perfect.
It's funny. One of the books that I read as I was getting ready to start the company was The Hard Thing About Hard Things from Ben Horowitz. Mm-hmm. And I read it, and there's all this advice and all of these examples of things that you should avoid doing. And I swear, I think I did every single one of them, even though I knew that I shouldn't do it from reading that book. It's just I think you don't really learn some of these things until you get into it. And you always think that you're a special snowflake and everything's different for you and your company. And that's why you have to learn a lot of things the hard way as you're going into uncharted territory.
Well, and you're dealing with people under a tremendous amount of stress, the higher highs, lower lows, and that sometimes doesn't lead to the best decisions. So I would be amazed if anyone did it perfect. But let's dig into SBOMs now. Software bills of material. It was funny. We did the SBOM Pavilion where there were 5 companies showing their wares. The idea was they'd have a common set of input, and we'd be able to see how they stacked up against each other, and attendees would be able to walk around and see different solutions with the same input. We didn't really achieve what we wanted to, I think, but some of the conversations and some of the processes that we went through in the SBOM challenge were very enlightening to me and left me with a lot of questions. So let me dig in, and then feel free to, direct us to other areas that you think were major lessons learned. But I'm trying to get a feel right now, because it surprised me a little bit in hearing the competitors talk. Who's the primary buyer now for a product or service of an SBOM? Who is it? Vendors? I'm sure it's a variety, but who is kind of the sweet spot where the industry is seeing the most action?
In my experience, it's the vendors who are building the products that are buying SBOM oriented solutions right now, more than the asset owners. The primary reason is there's a lot of reasons, and I'm sure we'll unpack some of this as we get further into it. But there's a nearer term immediate value for product security teams at a vendor when you collect all of these SBOMs, organize them, make them searchable, do vulnerability correlation on it as part of the product development process. The output of that work is more tangible. So you have this database of all of your software components. You can kind of think of it as the visibility layer of, network or OT security. You have to know what you have in order to do anything to defend that or manage the risk of it. So having that SBOM inventory for all of your product portfolio is very valuable to those teams inherently, even if they're not sharing the SBOMs with all of their customers. But they do know that those requests are starting to come and they need to be compliant with that. So we're seeing more demand right there right now, but I expect the market for SBOM tooling to expand out in
Oh,
both
sure.
directions of the supply
It's
chain.
it's early days. I was kind
Yeah.
of curious where we are in early days. And maybe one of the things that surprises me about that, not so much your answer, but I would have thought I'm the vendor, I'm making this product. I don't have to worry about binaries. I have the source, right? I Why can't I just I'm not trying to pull apart a binary and find out what's in there. I just look at my build and I say this is what's in there. I have all the information. Why are they looking at tools like this?
Well, so software supply chain security is interesting because it really is a chain or many chains with links in
Mhm.
them. And so if you look at the typical vendor who's building a product, we like to say that 80% of the code in a given device or given software application is third party to whomever is
Mhm.
pushing that out. Uh,
80% you said.
yeah, 80% on average is
Okay.
what we say. Now, I actually was talking to a company this morning and I threw that number out and they said, no way, it's got to be at least 95 to 99% third party in our products. So it's a very high percentage. And when you get into embedded systems in particular, you have a lot of third party components that are being delivered to the system integrator in binary form. You may
Okay.
have, chipsets that come with proprietary drivers. You may have proprietary operating systems that are coming in, third party hardware that has its own code that's running on it. You may have you then have open source as well that you're probably pulling in, and then you have your first party developers that are developing code. And so you have it coming from lots of different places. And it can be hard to get a really good grasp on that earlier in the development process. You may have things in there that you think are going to show up in the final build, but they get eliminated. And you may
Right.
have other issues that come in late in the process.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess going on from that, so if they're the primary, is there a secondary buyer? So if they were like number one, who would be number two?
Then we move into broadly what we would call the software consumers
Okay.
in the energy sector, in the OT security sector. That would be the asset owners who are buying and using the devices that are being supplied to them, devices or software artifacts that are being supplied to them. Um, yeah, go ahead.
And are you finding, I remember Eric Byers when he was first doing Tofino, there were a couple of large oil and gas companies that said, we're not going to buy your PLC or your controller unless it has a Tofino card in it as part of the roadmap. And then they kind of drove it. So are you seeing when you're talking about software users or asset owners in the OT space, are you seeing this primarily a small number that is put the stake in the ground, or are you seeing it more across, let's say, medium to large size companies?
It's growing. It's starting with a small number who are taking a firmer stance on this. And I think that the way that it's starting is um, actually a lot like third-party vendor risk management started, where
Hmm.
just, the value of the output of a questionnaire from a vendor is arguable. How useful is that? Um, but the act of getting a vendor to respond to all of those questions and seeing how well they can respond to it and how comprehensively they respond to it can be useful and insightful. And I think what we're seeing in the SBOM space is the mere act of asking for an SBOM and then
Mm.
looking at it to see if it's complete is a signal as to what level of visibility the manufacturer of that product has into their own software. And that is kind of, I think, where we are on the software consumer asset owner side of the supply chain right now, is using that as a signaling mechanism to understand the security a bit, even though it's definitely an incomplete view of the security of those products.
But in that case, they wouldn't be asking a company like yours to create the SBOM. They would be they just care about SBOMs. And I wrote an article about this on one of the early wins, is that you can get an early win just like you could on the security development life cycle, saying, do you have a threat model? Do you have fuzz testing, things like that? You don't even have to evaluate it so much. You just say, can they provide this artifact for me in a reasonable amount of time? So do you have an SBOM on your current version? Do you have your SBOM on 2 versions back? Can I see those? Well, if it takes them weeks to show it to you, they probably don't really have it under control. So I'd agree with you on the early wins. Let's One of the things that we hope to do in the challenge, and we didn't succeed, but we hope to get some view on the accuracy of SBOMs, with the idea that INL running it would have an answer key, that they would have maybe the source code, they would have deep knowledge of what was in there. I wouldn't have expected them to be perfect, but let's say they were 98% right, then they could say, how well did these tools do? We didn't achieve that. So let me ask it as a question. How accurate do you think your tool is?
I think that we are very accurate. We tend to, even when we go into the component suppliers and software development teams, we tend to uncover things that they don't realize are there, and
I believe that.
that's one of the advantages of looking at the end. Um, there are always false positives. There are always false negatives in any field of security, and
Hmm.
with SBOM generation, it's just part of the reality. You can never be at 100.0% because, especially when you're dealing with binary artifacts. If you're dealing with source code and you have all of it throughout your entire supply chain, you could probably get to 100%. But then you run into other issues like, accuracy is not just the ability to detect that a component is there, it's also the ability to name that component in the standard way that can be used for downstream security workflows, like being able to do vulnerability correlation. So there's a lot of challenges still in SBOM and vulnerability management and product security related to how do you properly name something so that you can correlate it to all of
Yeah.
the vulnerability sources as well. So there's a lot of different dimensions to accuracy. I'm not trying um, to not answer your question. I think that we have a very, very high accuracy rate, probably as good as anyone in the industry, above 99% in most cases. But it's squishy what accuracy really means in the SBOM world.
Well, I guess it's hard to know too, right?
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know. And it's funny when you said we find things they didn't know about. That is almost reminds me of the early days of the detection market. They were creating asset inventories, and there were a lot of assets that the asset owners didn't know about, but that's because they really had no asset inventory. So, it's kind of like that. And it was far from 100% in terms of what they found. If you're saying, let's say, use your 80% number, if you're saying 80% are binaries, 80% of the code is binaries, I would be amazed if you didn't find a whole lot of things they don't know
Well,
about.
just to caveat that, about 80% of the code is going to be third party. Now, some of that may be binary and some of it may be
Okay.
open source that you can look at. And it depends on the application too. So if you have something
Okay.
that, let's say, a virtual machine that's running on some hardware, you may get the operating system, you may get the base virtual machine image in binary form with lots of binaries in it. You may get containers that have lots of binaries
Hmm.
in it. So there's still maybe a very high percentage of binaries when you look at software, but it really depends on the environment that you're working in.
Well, I think it's important to note that it's not going to be perfect, because I've had a few people reach out to me with all sorts of things, and I've had a few people reach out to me that said they've looked at these tools with some really smart people and found things that they've missed. Um, people that were world-class reverse engineers, they
Oh
said,
yeah.
okay, I'm going to do this and I'm going to find something they missed. And guess what? They did it. Um, what do you think happens in the real world if an SBOM is incomplete? How much does that degrade the value of it if it's not perfect?
I think that I think the comparison to asset inventory is a good one, right? So if you have if you have to manually generate your asset inventory all the time,
Hmm.
it's pretty hard to do and pretty hard to maintain, and it requires a lot of effort. If you can automatically generate it to 95%, your life is a lot easier. I think SBOMs are similar. Now, if you know that there may be inaccuracies, the way that we've designed SBOMs and the file formats that are there, and the way that we exchange this information, the way we detect it, the way that we recognize that there's a supply chain that these files have to move through, we give the humans who are involved an opportunity to make corrections to those
Hmm.
things. Vex, for example, with revisions to SBOMs, all of that exists because it's hard to be 100.0% perfect in all of these things. I don't think it means that SBOMs are not valuable. I think that they are, even recognizing that there may be some false positives that come out of the tools that are automatically generating them. As long as you incorporate those tools into a process, like everything else in security, you can get the accuracy to a really good level and then make sure that it's being distributed. But trying to do it without humans whatsoever is going to be a fool's errand.
Yeah, and I think I guess saying it's similar to an asset inventory in terms of value with not 100% completeness is a good analogy. If you told me I can only have a 98% asset inventory, do I still want to bother doing it? The answer is yes. I still want to know what those 98% are. I'm a little bummed I don't know the 2% yet, but um, I can see that. One of the things that came up, and I didn't really participate that much in the challenge, but I was on some of the calls. And one of the things that surprised me was how many questions there were from you and your counterparts. By the way, I'm talking with Matt Wyckhouse, CEO and founder of Finite State. Um, but there were 3 or 4 companies there, and there was a lot of questions. What is the underlying OS? Is it packed? Is it encrypted? All these sorts of questions. And I really got the feel that what exists today is, well, you called it a solution. I would call it more of a service, but it's definitely a combination of a product that the teams have created and their talent using that product to deal with a wide variety of environments they're encountering. It the way the challenge was built was we send you this thing, you insert it into a product, it spits out an SBOM, and I'm getting that that's not really very common these days. That more often than not, there's some level of interaction with the customer. What is EOS? What is this? What is that? Um, what is your view on that? Because again, this was just me sitting out on the outside watching, being a little surprised by the questions. Where are we now in this in terms of product, service, solution?
I think it really depends on the vendor and the maturity of the company and how much they've invested in automation. For us, binary goes in, SBOM comes out. That's the intent. We allow our customers, the users, to make corrections and
Hmm.
annotations on that within our platform because, like I said, it's a human plus a computer together that solve the SBOM problem. It doesn't have to be a finite state person behind the scenes,
Right.
making the hamster wheels run. Um, the However, I think there's a lot of different approaches in the market to the problem, and where all of us need to keep investing in engineering is I'll go back to the detection engineering analogy.
Hmm.
If you want to be able to analyze SEL protocols, you need to add support for the SEL protocols.
Yep.
You may need to work with them or try to parse out those protocols yourself. Same thing with dealing with binary artifacts. If you, for example, have never dealt with VxWorks as an operating system, you probably don't have the tooling in your product to be able to know what sort of security issues to look for, how to decompose VxWorks and all of the subsystems of VxWorks, how to deal with the binary offsets and unravel the functions and all that sort of stuff. So it is, the compatibility part of all of these tool providers is important because that'll tell you when you have an arbitrary binary, how likely is it that it's going to be successful. The
Mm.
reason that for the questions around encryption and debug were coming up is because if any of the vendors are handed an encrypted binary, we're not going to do anything with it. We're not going to try to break, there's no automated way to just break encryption arbitrarily. Um, and we shouldn't be trying to do that, to be honest. We, in that case, should be saying we need to facilitate a request for this data from the vendor rather than trying to analyze it ourselves.
Okay. I like the analogy to the detection market because I think I've written or talked about that before. Is that early on it was how many protocols do you support? Do you support this one? Do you support that one? And that was really a measuring stick, which kind of made me think at this point we're still early, although you're 5.5 years in, we're still early in the market that people are building that up. You don't hear that in the detection market much anymore about whether you're going to buy product X or Y. Um, and maybe we'll get there. I mean, how long do you think until we get there where it's not your level of support that's going to be a big deal? Or is this different than detection where it's always going to be a competitive issue?
Well, I think sometimes I like to take a step back and think about the magnitude of the problem. So,
Okay.
you and I have talked about how important SBOM generation is versus SBOM collection and dissemination and vulnerability correlation.
Hmm.
So we think about the SBOM generation problem, and we start with what percentage of software that exists in any relevant environment has an SBOM for it today? Like, has an SBOM ever been created for it? The answer is maybe 1/10%, maybe 100th of a percent. It's a really small fraction. And so the idea of software transparency at large, and the SBOM initiative in particular, is that we have to get this thing bootstrapped somehow so that there's value. So if you're an asset owner and you can only look at SBOMs for 1/10 of a percent of the devices on your network, it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest in tooling for that and using it. And so we need to figure out how to generate those SBOMs so that they can be useful. We can action on them and develop these workflows around them. So we have a big problem. And when we look at software, like all the software that we might encounter, it's arguably the compatibility problem is significantly harder than the number of proprietary network protocols that you might run into
Yeah,
in an
it's
OT
true.
network because there's so many different formats that exist.
Hmm.
So it's a
You
large scale.
Yeah. You probably were happy to see a mention of SBOM in the National Cybersecurity Strategy. Not super prominent, but it got part of a bullet, so it was certainly in there. Um, I wonder, especially with federal use of SBOMs, because that's where they're really driving. I think that's their approach is we'll require this, government will require it. We're such a big purchaser. We touch so many vendors that it's going to force a large part of the industry to do this, and maybe that's what gets the ball rolling and such. And I understand that strategy, but I almost wonder if when they get there. So let's say they get there. Maybe their timelines keep shifting. Maybe it's 3 years, 5 years where they're getting delivered all these SBOMs. What are they going to do with them? I mean, to me, it's almost like the dog that catches the car, right? You get all these SBOMs. They're currently so overwhelmed with patching and cyber maintenance and cyber what they call cyber hygiene. I can't imagine the government itself being able to handle something that now is 10xing or you pick your X, maybe it's 50X, I don't know, maybe it's 5X, but some exponential increase of the type of work that they have to do around this software patching, software update problem. What is the government going to do with all this? Do you think they're setting themselves up for failure, or will they just get the information and declare victory?
I think
Or characterize it your own way. Mine are probably a little rougher than you want to be.
no. I think that it's the right question. To date, we haven't seen a lot of operationalization of SBOM, right? It's just
Hmm.
not happening. I can say, having spent a lot of time talking to folks in industry and the government at S4 a couple weeks ago, one thing that we know is, for example, no one has ever successfully taken a network of any size and said, give me the SBOMs for all the things on this network and let's do something with it. It's never
Hmm.
happened. Um, Now, I think that we can change that, and that's going to happen this year. And we're going to try to drive that forward. I'm sure other vendors are working on similar things. But what you do with SBOMs once you've collected them is the next step in the maturation of the market on the consumer side. Like I was saying earlier, right now it's more of a check on whether someone can produce that
Hmm.
SBOM. It's a gate to get those vendors to go through. In order to operationalize them, you need to collect them, put them into a system that you can inventory and query, and then develop workflows around them, push that data into vulnerability management programs and into threat detection programs and all of the other tooling that's on that network to allow your security teams to actually get value out of this. And those need to be built out next. Will the government agencies who are requesting all of these be on the forefront of that, or will they be lagging behind? I think remains to be seen. But they are driving the initiatives forward in the way that you just said. With the power of government purchasing is causing more device manufacturers to opt into developing SBOMs. The language in the National Cybersecurity Strategy around software liability should be encouraging everyone who's building software to invest in security wholesale, not just SBOMs. So I think they've been doing a good job of, as I like to say, the federal government has been cranking this flywheel and the market is taking over as well. And we continue to keep the momentum going on software supply chain security with
Hmm.
SBOM being a big driver behind it.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about where the market will be, but I want to try to stay in the next 1 to 3 years, because I think it'll be a while before it gets there. Um, and I have an article that I need to finish up and get out on that. Um, but I have a couple of questions here I wanted to hit. Do you think there will be a separate OT SBOM market, or is there just going to be an SBOM market as it matures?
I think that um, SBOM as kind of a category may live as a category on its own for a while. I don't think it'll be an OT specific category of tooling, because part of the reason is when you look at an OT network, there's a lot of OT specific stuff, but there's also other stuff like
Yep.
gear and physical access control systems and things like that that might be in the same environment. And so you need to make sure that you can handle arbitrary devices in whatever solution that you build out. So I think that there will be companies that specialize there more than others, but I think that just managing SBOMs is probably where we'll land in that market.
Yeah, I mean, one of the competitors, NetRise, was not doing Windows, although they did tackle Windows in the challenge a little bit, but they're just straightforward. No, we don't do Windows. We do embedded OSs.
Right.
But again, it's very new, and you might see various combinations. They could add that later on or something like that. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you, because especially if I'm an organization, I care, pick a large manufacturer. Let's pick Dole, for example, since they've been in the news. They have OT and IT. I can't imagine that they're not going to care about their IT SBOMs, right? So are they going to have two separate vendors? I think where you could run into some interesting things is from a marketplace example. So if I was querying something and I said, okay, I need to go get my information on Schneider Electric, Aviva, a few of their other partners. This is where I need to go to pull in SBOM information on version 6.2 of EcoStructure or something like that. I could see that place where I'm pulling it in from being a specialty place. I don't know that we'll get a marketplace that has everything I want, but I would like to have a protocol that pulls that in from the whichever source I want, rather than having to support 2 or 3. But I guess thinking it through, maybe it doesn't really matter as long as my tool that pulls it in can support 2 or 3. I mean, I said I wasn't going to talk about the future, and I just bounded into the future. It's as an analyst or a voyeur, it's such a fascinating way to look at where this market is going to go.
Yeah, the marketplace concept is an interesting one, and one that we're working through as well. So I like to talk about the reason SBOM came to be was to try to take vulnerability management, which was going through a centralized database, the
Yeah.
NVD primarily, and try to decentralize and distribute this out a bit more. And that helps us with like speed to response of new vulnerabilities, and it helps to decentralize the workload, allow the users of software to take some of this into their own hands. And so the idea of SBOM is, let's allow users, the consumers of software, to collect their SBOMs from their vendors and store them locally, and then they get to make an assertion on whether they're impacted by a vulnerability as soon as that vulnerability comes out, and then they can decide what they want to do. Now, so that's a decentralized model. They go to each vendor and they collect this stuff, but it seems like a lot of work. So the concept of a marketplace is, let's streamline that so that you don't have to, if you're a municipal utility somewhere, you don't have to figure out, where do I go to for every single one of these products that I have, and try to collect all this data. And the challenge with the marketplace, I think, for the market to nail this, you have to figure out how to do a marketplace without going back to a centralized vulnerability management system, because we know that centralized vulnerability management doesn't work, because we can't be responsive enough and fast enough and correct enough to do it that way. So I think the facilitation, like you said, the protocol of making sure it's very easy to connect the consumers and producers of software and exchange this information, is where the marketplace concept will win out.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to set that aside. I had about 8 things I wanted to say about that, but we'll go down that rabbit hole. Let's hit one more thing. Where are we now on VEX? I thought we had 3 goals for this. One was, for the challenge. One, could you create SBOMs? Could you find vulnerabilities in those created SBOMs? And then could you incorporate VEX into those? And I was surprised, and maybe I shouldn't, because Tom Ulrich is writing about this about every 3rd week in great detail, but I was surprised that we weren't a little further in VEX, that there was a lot of questions. Well, how are you going to provide it to us? What's it going to look like? What do you want us to do with it? Where, in your opinion, where are we with VEX now? And for those who don't know, I mean, VEX, as I would describe it, is a way of telling you whether this vulnerability that is in a component in the SBOM actually is exploitable and something you need to worry about. So that can reduce the number of vulnerabilities you need to worry about dramatically. Some have said, again, you hear various numbers. Some say 80, 90%, some say 2/3, but significantly more than half the vulnerabilities in the components are probably not exploitable and shouldn't be prioritized. So with that as a little intro, where do you see us today with VEX as a community?
It is it's not widely adopted yet. And part of that is, if we go back to earlier in the conversation when we were talking about the adoption of SBOM from software consumers, if we don't have a lot of utilization of that data, the demand for VEX is lower, because really the reason that VEX came to be is we said, all right, let's create SBOMs. Then we're going to share these SBOMs. And when we started doing that in some POCs, we realized that, the software consumers think that we're vulnerable, that product is vulnerable to
Right.
10 times as much as it actually is. And now my team is responding to all of these false positives all the time. I need to have a way to communicate that data.
Right.
But if they're not doing anything with it, the demand for VEX in the market is lower. And so I think the maturity for VEX is less than it is for the SBOM formats. However, there are two well-established formats for VEX data. There's the CycloneDX format and there's the CSAF format, both of which support standardized distribution of vulnerability data and the affected status for vulnerabilities that are there for the components that you're interested in. I think that there was maybe some lack of adherence to standards in the VEX files that we received during the challenge, which caused some confusion. How strong the standards are they standards or are they suggestions, is still something that we're working out, I think, as a market. I think we're getting there. I think that there just hasn't been enough exchange of software supply chain security data, enough of an implementation of this to really get us to work out all of the kinks of it. And part of what I've been talking with some of the government folks about is I feel like we've been doing a lot of think tanking on SBOM and VEX and stuff instead of practice. And these are the things that come out when you actually go to implement it. We will see all of those edge cases and corner cases and say, okay, we actually need to make this field a required field so that we don't have any more confusion in the future. Or this reference ID should be very specific to this particular file format, and we don't accept anything else. Those are the things that are still being worked out that we'll find in practice versus in a think tank scenario.
Yeah, there were a lot of comments about fields, both with the SBOM and the VEX in those calls. Like which fields are you going to use? Which are you going to provide? Which ones are you going to be evaluating whether we handled it properly and such? And there was, I think that was again another learning experience. But I was surprised by that because again, I've always assumed that you and your compatriots and the government would solve this, and we would have SBOMs and a protocol and VEX, and then we just have to figure out how the heck to use them and distribute them. But it sounded like we were a little earlier on getting that all solidified than maybe I expected, which was a learning for me.
I think that there's some of that for sure. But I think that there is also flexibility in how you use the formats right now. A good example is, what do you do with files when you're reporting an SBOM? So an SBOM is designed originally to report all the third-party software that's there. So you have components that are packages you might get from GitHub or NPM or Python packages or binary packages that you're pulling in. But you may also have, when you actually take a binary and you unpack it and you expand out all the files that are in there, you have all of these files, some of which are not even executable files. They're just configuration files. Should you report all of those files when you generate an SBOM, or is that just noise? That's a choice that every vendor in the space has to make. We choose not to report every single file that we've extracted because we think it's noisy. Others in the challenge decided to report all of those. So like there's flexibility in the format, and I think we're still in the early days of understanding which direction everyone wants to go. Do you want to generate these massive files you're sending around? Do you want to just provide the important data? The same thing with VEX. Do we want to assert every vulnerability? Do we want to put a status on it and continue to have this growing VEX document that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time? Or do we want to assert the vulnerabilities that do impact us that we've verified and manage it that way? And there's a debate in the community about that too. So there's, I think flexibility is fine. I think that we have some good standards that work pretty well. We can exchange this data. There's flexibility in implementation. And I think the market will kind of shake out how we want to handle some of these things.
When those files change, let's say one of those files changes, does that change the version of the
It,
code?
so that's, part of the issue. So if you have, let's say you have a Linux-based device and you make one change to one config file for your Nginx server
Yeah.
that's on there, that changes the artifact completely. The hash of that software now is different, that binary package. And so um, you could change, it could lead to a change of the entire SBOM, and you have to go get you have to get the new SBOM for that new thing and match that the hashes are correct. So that's, the scale of the number of SBOMs to collect is and manage is quite high for that reason.
Yeah, I could see certain files where this would make a big difference. For example, if I had a configuration file that had the default password and whether HTTP and Telnet and TFTP are turned on or off by default, that would be a file that if that changed, or I might want to know, let's say it was in all the insecure by default settings, I would like to know that whether I have that file or don't have that file. So I would hope the version would change, but then there's so many other probably non-security related things in the files that I really wouldn't care. And I wouldn't say, what do you mean? We have to have a whole new SBOM because they decided, to change a header or a little text help file or something like that. So now I need to create a whole new SBOM. So I can see where it gets really ugly.
I'm glad you brought up this case too, because another point I like to discuss is that SBOMs are not equivalent to software supply chain security. And they're certainly not equivalent to vulnerability management for devices, because a lot of the things that you just said, hard-coded passwords and insecure services,
Mhm.
um, those aren't going to show up in an SBOM no
Right.
matter what. You might have a file hash that says there is an Etsy password file and it has a hash in it, but there's nothing in an SBOM that would tell you this has these hard-coded credentials. That's a separate thing. That's other security testing
Mhm.
files that could come from static analysis or a pen test or something like that, that you would want to go alongside an SBOM. I think that there's, part of what we're seeing in the market right now is because SBOM is easier to think about, it's becoming synonymous with software supply chain security or software risk management, which is a little dangerous. And it's a slippery slope where we might try to introduce some of these other concepts into the SBOM file formats, and we start making things very muddy and dangerous. And I think that we want to keep SBOM doing what it is, which is third-party software component risk management. And then we still need these other types of testing that you're going to do. And you may want to collect those other types of results from your vendors too. If you look at Executive Order 1428, if you look at the National Cybersecurity Strategy, there's talk of those things too, because SBOM alone isn't the silver bullet that solves all of the problems. It solves a big chunk of them.
But I'd have to go back and look. I don't know if it was with you or someone else from your company, but I remember. No, it wasn't a podcast. It was a demo. I remember getting an early demo from Finite State. Now this probably wasn't 5 years ago, but maybe 4 years ago. And one of the things you were touting, your company was touting, and others in your sector still do, and you might as well. I haven't really looked at your marketing things super closely in the last year, but they were touting the ability to find these issues. Hey, not only can we give you an SBOM, but part of our solution is we will identify other security issues in your code. So they kind of, I mean, you might buy a solution from a vendor in your SBOM category that could be one of the big value adds, or at least what they're promoting as a value add.
Absolutely. And that's why there's an entire market for AppSec tools, for example. There's AppSec
Hmm.
tools for static analysis and dynamic analysis and pen testing and orchestration and correlation, all sorts of things, because software security is similar to cybersecurity. There's no one tool that's going to solve all of the problems. And so when you're thinking about evaluating the security of a product that you're using or buying, I think you need to think about it through that same lens. If SBOM will only tell you SBOM alone tells you what third-party components, third-party to your vendor,
Mhm.
components are in the software that you're buying, and what known vulnerabilities affect them, what reported vulnerabilities affect them.
Mhm.
It doesn't tell you about zero-day vulnerabilities. It doesn't tell you about the secure software development practices that the company may or may not have. It doesn't tell you about insecure configurations. It doesn't tell you about the hardware. There's a lot of things it doesn't tell you that you may care about. And I think that if we take a big step back, the reason SBOM is gaining so much traction, the reason we're talking about it so much is because it is the first step in software transparency, the first step in software supply chain security, and we're going to layer on these other things. And the AppSec industry is already doing this on the development side for those who are investing in it. But there's more to come that we need to make sure we have a rounded view of everything.
Okay, now you really opened it up. So we have a few more minutes here, but I saw Finite State recently announced, it might have been this week or last week, a new platform, right? And one of the bullets was you can import information from some of those tools you've been talking about. I think there were like 120 tools or something like that that you could import data from, which would, as you say, which would go well beyond what an SBOM does. So does Finite State as a company, are you an SBOM company, or how would you name yourself as a company? And do you think that's a category for the industry, or do you think there will be an SBOM category and then whatever category you would put Finite State in?
So we think about ourselves as software risk management, software supply chain security, and we are an SBOM enabled version of that because SBOM is a key part of the software supply chain security equation right now.
Mhm.
Um, so part of the reason that we've launched this new platform and are adding all of these new ingest capabilities to it is because we want to remove the barriers to collecting security artifacts from your vendors. So if they say, well, we don't have an SBOM, this product, for example, something similar to Artifact 2 that was in the challenge, they may say an SBOM doesn't actually apply to this product. It's all first party code. Well, you can say, well, why don't you give me the static analysis results that you have so that I understand what sort of security testing you've done on it. Or someone may not have an SBOM in a format that they like, but they have some tools that are generating things that reference software components. Well, we can pull those in and we can extract the software components from them and generate an SBOM for you. So that's the reason that we're looking at it that way, is we want to have a bit more
Okay.
holistic view of the security of products, and we want to remove the barriers or the points of resistance that vendors may not be able to comply with. We want to enable you to look at the risk of a product as a whole.
Okay. And then just to finish up, is there any topic we didn't cover that you said, oh man, this weekend I had in Miami amongst all these people talking SBOMs, this is something we need to talk more about, or this is something I learned, or something everyone's getting wrong?
I think there's two. The first is probably a softball here, but I will say, having been in a few S4s now, when we go back just a year, um, the market understanding of SBOM and software supply chain security has had a dramatic shift in 1 year.
Mm.
And I think that the S4, embracing SBOM and having the SBOM Pavilion and the SBOM Challenge went a long way to doing this. But most everyone who was in attendance at least knew what an SBOM was, and many of them knew what it wasn't. And that's a really dramatic ramp in 1 year, which I think was a very interesting takeaway. We didn't talk to anyone who said, well, tell me what an SBOM is and what this even means. Everyone seems to understand that already, which was an interesting kind of observation on market maturity.
I think, just before you give me your second one, now you're a little bit skewed there because we do target the more advanced attendee. So it'd be interesting if you went to like an ICS JWG or something like that, whether you saw that still to be true. But I would agree with your underlying contention that there's been a lot of growth in awareness and education over the last year, and the government does deserve a lot of credit for that, as do, the fact that there's multiple companies now with funding going out there evangelizing this, speaking on this. There's a lot of people that have been pushing this. So I'd agree with you in general, but I'd be a little worried about saying that S4 was the state of the market. It'd be interesting to get another data point on that. What was your second one?
The second one is, despite all of this interest in software transparency and SBOMs, I think that vendors and asset owners are still not talking to each other enough. Not the security teams aren't talking to each other enough. One of the fun things we did, maybe one of my favorite parts of the conference, was we were able to pull together 4 different device manufacturers, their product security teams, and 5 different utilities, and put them in a room and say, okay, everyone wants to share SBOMs. Let's talk about how we actually make that happen. And there were some really interesting discussions that came out of that. And probably more than that, there were some relationships that were built that didn't exist before that point, which was really exciting to see, because I think the industry at large likes to think of vendors and asset owner security teams being adversarial to each other. But in my experience, when you actually put them together, they want to collaborate and they recognize that we all have the same goals.
Yeah. Oh, that would have been a fun meeting. I wish you had caught that on camera, but it probably wouldn't have been as good then if people were on the record on that. But yeah, no, that needs to happen more, and it is. I do believe there's a good chance that, again, going back to the Tofino thing, that you're going to get some large vendors and large asset owners that are going to create some needs that are going to jumpstart this. I think this is going to be more top down than bottom up, where you just get a bunch of small players that say we need this, but we'll see.